For every end, there is a beginning. And for every beginning, there is an end. You know, the night comes, and we know that eventually the dawn will rise, and the night will come to an end. We know that everything comes to an end. And the Lord Jesus reminds us that even time itself will come to an end. But in the meantime, we need to realize that every end is also a beginning. You know, I can't tell you the number of times where, I've celebrated a funeral, and in the midst of the sorrow, one of the family members announces that they're expecting. That idea of the end and a new beginning. And it happens again and again and again. It seems almost like life is circular, but it's not. The reality is that there is a spiral to time, because we'll come back again to Advent next year, but we won't be the same people. These little ones will be bigger, older, and there will be some of us that won't be here next year. The world will have changed. Time moves on, and it keeps moving toward an end. But again, it's a spiral that's heading not downward, but upward. That is the role of time itself, to lead us ultimately to God. I remember years ago when I was in the seminary, we had in my last year a course that was taught by one of the professors from the University of Michigan, and it was Grief, Death, and Dying. It was from the School of Human Relations. It was called Grief, Death, and the Dying, but my classmates referred to it as Gloom, Doom, and Tomb. And it was one of those things that, it was an interesting experience, because it wasn't teaching us about things, but asking us to reflect so that we would be better able to minister to people who are going through grief, no matter what the cause may be, whether it be death or the death of a relationship or some other struggle, to understand what people are going through, to walk with them on that journey. And one of the exercises the professor had us do was to draw a picture of death. And I got to tell you, I was kind of outstanding in that class. The others my classmate drew a death of a corpse with a tag on the toe. But not Howell. No. The professor came by and looked down at my desk and he said, "Dave, that's an interesting impression. I don't think I've ever thought of death looking like that." And what I had drawn was a mountain, and at the top of it was a door, the beautiful door that was cracked open and bright light coming out of it. But death is not something we sink down into, but rather we strive to go upward so that we might pass through death to life. Because even the great end is a beginning. And that's what the Lord Jesus is reminding us of in the gospel today. The question is not, should we worry about the end? Should we become anxious or fearful? He tells us, don't worry about it. Stand tall. If you're living faithfully, there is no reason to be concerned. Because the Lord of love will recognize his own at the end. And we're called to live as his own. But even more important, as time spirals upward, that you and I become more and more like Christ. We become people of greater kindness, of greater compassion, of greater mercy, people of hope, people of promise, that somehow you and I, who gather here to celebrate the death and the rising of the Lord Jesus, like the bread and the wine that are transformed, that you and I are transformed to become more and more like Christ in the way we live our lives each day. bringing his promise and his hope to a world that desperately needs to see it. Because there is reason to be fearful in this world. There's reason to despair. Evil continues in our world, despite the fact that Lord Jesus' death and rising brings the promise of more. We know that there are still times that the world is much less than it could be. And you and I need to be a sign of his promise. You and I are called to become more like the Lord Jesus in the way we live, the way we love, the way we hope, the way we express that by the way we live our daily lives. That's why we gather here Sunday after Sunday. You know, every now and then people will say, oh, yeah, you know, it's the same thing over and over again. And I go, really? I don't see that, but maybe it's because I participate a little bit more. You know? Some people come here like this is a spectator sport, and they just sit and watch. I'm going to say for those who participate, it's something much more. It's something that calls us, that speaks to our heart, that brings out the best in us. You know, there have been more than a few times over the last 46 years that I've served others, that I've been caught up in the sadness and the sorrow and the trials of people's lives, and feel that burden not just weighing down on them, but weighing down on me as well. And then there's something wonderful about coming here or to any of the altars at which I've served over the years. And somehow, in the midst of celebrating the Eucharist, I realize that God is doing something even in the midst of that. Even as winter settles over the earth and it looks like death. Under the soil, my brothers and sisters, things are happening. Preparing for the spring when everything will come to life once more. We may not see it, but God is at work in the nature of the world that he created. And God is at work in our lives, even in the most difficult times, inviting us to grow through those, to become more. Inviting us to become more again and again, each day, each time we gather, to become more, not just for ourselves, but for one another. You know, one of the things that sometimes is distressing is people will say, well, it doesn't matter if I'm not there. And I go, really? And who might you have sat next to that day that needed to have a smile or a word of encouragement or a sense that somebody cared? No, we come here not just for ourselves, but for one another, so that together, you and I, as we move through the spiral of time, to become more. So that you and I can become more and more like Christ. More and more and more. That's the invitation of Advent, to become more. That's the invitation that the Lord extends to us all as we move through time toward the end, to become more.